Hey, good morning, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. My name is Ahmed Morsi. I'm one of the co-founders of the Arab Political Science Network, and I'm currently a visiting fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Qatar, in Doha. Today is our last session in our seminar series on politics and war in the Middle East and North Africa. Today's title is Everyday Life and War, and we are excited to have colleagues who have experience doing research on everyday life during violence, war, and genocide. And we would look forward to hearing about their work and the reflections on what's going on in the Middle East so far. I'll start by quick updates in terms of this session is recorded. It's live streamed also on Facebook, and it's in English. There is Arabic interpretation if anyone on Zoom needs that. You can check the Arabic interpretation or the interpretation sign. You can send questions through the Q&A button, and Sami, our moderator, is going to collect them and use them to feed to our speakers. I'll introduce Sami briefly, and then he's going to introduce the session and our colleagues who are going to be speaking today. So Sami is a director of the Liberal Arts Program and associate professor in residence of anthropology at Northwestern University in Qatar. He obtained his PhD from the Department of Anthropology at Princeton, and he's the author of two books that are very relevant to the conversation today. One is called War is Coming: Between Past and Future Violence in Lebanon in 2017, and the other is My Brother, My Land: A Story from Palestine, which came out in 2024. Sami will be moderating today's session and sharing with us as well his views on and reflecting on from his experience about that topic. Without further ado, thank you, Sami. Thank you, Wendy, Asma, and Rana, and looking forward to your contribution.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you all for joining us, and to the Arab Political Science Network for inviting me to moderate and for holding this really important conversation. Um, I think just we're speaking from in this moment. I think this particular topic. Obviously, it's always relevant, but maybe more relevant than ever. And I don't know, I'm not going to do justice to any kind of context and the genocide that's happening to Palestinians in Gaza, but Palestinians, in all historic Palestine. But also then what's happening in the larger region, in the Levant especially, but also in other parts of North Africa and just in general. I'm not going to take up too much time as moderator, and especially the fact that I've worked on these issues. I can also say a lot, but I don't. I know we all want to hear from our speakers. So I just say very briefly, from I've always been drawn to this notion of everyday, because I feel like it can open up larger questions. So by focusing on sort of the micro experiences and feelings and tactics, maybe we can discover more empathy for the earth and all that exists in and on it. And to think that every day it has a history, it exists in the world, it has a context, and it's not really fixed. And to think of it as more than just daily living, but that it shapes us in so many ways. And I think the terms, war and everyday are both very loaded, and I don't even know if we'll have a chance to unpack the whole thing in today's conversation, but hopefully we can scratch some of the surface. But even just to say war, and thinking of the three contexts that our speakers work in or work on, is a sort of catch-all phrase that doesn't come close to giving us a sense of what's really going on in between, genocide or settler colonialism, or the war of a dictator versus civil war and all these kinds of differences that exist. So just, I'm going to stop there and introduce our speakers, and then we'll sort of launch into the conversation. I didn't ask you which sort of who wants to start, but if you don't mind, I'm just going to go with the way it is on in the invitation. So I think it was Rana, Wendy, and then Asma. So I'm going to introduce you in that order, if you don't mind. So Rana Barakat, Professor Rana Barakat, is an associate professor of history at Birzeit University in Palestine, where she's also the director of the Birzeit University Museum. Her forthcoming book with University of North Carolina Press in the Critical Indigeneities series is titled Ongoing Return, Storytelling as a Map of Return to Lifta and Palestine. Next is Professor Wendy Perlman, is the Jane Long Professorship of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University. She's the author of 6 books, including 3 of interviews conveying personal experiences of violence in Palestine or in Syria. So the titles of 3 of them are Occupied Voices, Stories of Everyday Life from the Second Intifada. That was 2003. We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria in 2017. And The Home I Worked to Make, Voices from the New Syrian Diaspora in 2024. Last but not least, Professor Asma Khalifa. Asma, in Arabic, we oftentimes say professor when you start your journey to be a professor. So Asma is a doctoral researcher at the German Institute for Global Area Studies, focusing on the impact of civil war on gender relations in politics. She's also an associate fellow at the MENA program at Chatham House. In 2017, she was named one of the 100 most influential young Africans by the Africa Youth Awards. And she's also co-founder of the Tamazight Women's Movement. So thank you all for joining us today. Very quickly, the way we'll run this is to give you around 5 to 7 minutes for some opening remarks. And then if there's time, I'll ask questions or I'll jump straight to audience questions or sort of go back and forth. And so let's begin. And I guess sort of with a broad kind of question that you can decide to answer or, kind of go off on sort of your thoughts. But I wanted to see if you could tell us a little bit of how you've been thinking and working with and on this theme, and the sort of concepts maybe that have been most generative to you. Yeah, and with that, Rana, if you could lead us.
Sure. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Sammy, I might need a little bit more than 7 minutes, but I'll try to be as gracious as possible. And I should begin by saying this isn't as much about the everyday as it's more of a scream, because I am the one here speaking from Palestine, so I will take that role. Thank you for this invitation into this ongoing conversation. I want to thank Yasmin Gardan and Ahmed Morsi for the invitation and facilitation. Also, thanks to I guess now we're old friends, huh, Sammy? To my old friend, Sammy, for holding space for us here, and for Wendy and Esma. It's my honor to be in this space with you. So as described in the invitation, this session intends to look at how war and conflict impact people's everyday life. But in the midst of this bloody genocide against Palestine and Palestinian life, the very idea of everyday life is as curious as it is dangerous. I've spent the better part of my own academic career quite literally screaming that Palestine is not an exception. But as the days have turned into weeks and weeks into months and now years, 20 months of what is now the attempted utter annihilation, that is the continuity of 78 years of the Nakba and the ongoing Nakba, and over a century of settler colonial violence against the very idea of life in Palestine. Every day is about survival. But I ask everybody in this room to not reduce Palestinians to a metric of survival that fits into an essentializing mold of seeing Palestinians as helpless victims. Of course, war has its victims, and there are many. But if one is to learn from Palestinian survival and generations of it, one needs to simply work to see more. And in that work, understand that intellectualism bears a deep human and political responsibility. And so as Shireen Saikali's invitation resonates in this room and beyond, Palestine is a paradigm. And as Shireen tells us, we have lessons of abundance to share with you and not only scarcity. Palestine, it should go without saying, is not a laboratory nor a problem to be solved. It is frankly astounding to me how this idea of who we are, generations of who we are, is still being treated by so many as a laboratory. That only makes sense if we allow ourselves to fall into the colonial and settler colonial frameworks whose very definition and being is to eliminate us as a people and as persons, and to whom our lives are so easily reduced to measure the metrics of how nefarious and insidious elimination can be. And so I shall take this opportunity to urge us all to understand that the Palestinian struggle and a people's remarkable endurance is not something to fetishize. We do not need to be given voices. This is not a question of permission to narrate, with all love and respect to Edward Said, but rather the struggle here is how do people listen, hear, gather, and mobilize. For these atrocities need to end, and the vicious world that enables and supports the attempted elimination of an entire people need to be held accountable. And we need to work together to understand that Palestine is world making. We are, as our elders taught us, in this together. So now, more than 20 months into this relentless reality of a live stream genocide, as the perpetuators of this horror create even more engineered chaos through the lands of Palestine, from the river to the sea, from the killing fields in Gaza, a strip only made so by colonial fragmentations, and to the armies of settlers and a settler army across the West Bank where I am. In a land marked by prisons, the small in the form of torture chambers where the settler forces have arrested more than 11,000 Palestinians since October 2023, to the larger prison, otherwise known as military occupation, that now in 2025 is the apex and center of the long arch of fascism. I want to ask, if only rhetorically, but honestly and with earnest, what does it mean to rehearse the atrocities of this genocide? After all, everyone in this session is privy to observing the genocide of a people, like everyone in this cruel present. One that is not just about Palestine, but it is about the monsters that choose to rule through endless and clearly ever-growing violence, without the red lines that we were told will hold after the lessons of imperial wars of the 20th century. What does it mean to bear witness to this all? What does it mean to be invited into a space like this one to hold a conversation about it? What is it that we're actually doing? To be honest, I don't know. In the face of all this death, I want to tell you that Palestinian survival offers lessons of hope in understanding the enduring relationality of ourselves to each other and the land. Lessons from Palestine that connects us to peoples of lands ravaged by imperialism for centuries. I want to share with you that love, the core of this relationality, will be the foundation for the abundance of lessons towards the future. But what does that even mean? What can that possibly mean when the massacres grow even more incomprehensibly brutal and mind-breaking? I am certain of one thing. In all of this violence, Palestine and Palestinians will not be eliminated. I know that Palestine is world-making, but I also know that the burden of the cruel world ending lies on the broken bodies, endless piles of rubble, and scorched earth of Palestine. And I know that the responsibility and a hope for a future beyond this apocalypse is also on Palestinians. This is not only about hope, but rather is built on a trust that the world is changing. And as the sky falls over Palestine, this is the bloody exit of a cruel world that is aided, abetted, and enacted, the attempted end of an entire people. But that too is not new. For this genocidal violence, enacted by the military machines of this settler state, is the culmination of over 5 centuries of apocalyptic violence. So maybe history can offer us small threads towards a larger narrative, specifically about Palestine and Palestinians in a historical frame and understanding, maybe a light through this ever-growing darkness. But even in this historical contemplation, in this space, and in spite of my own earlier questions, I do know a few things. I do know that I need not do what we are often called upon to do. That is, I do not need to remind people that this is not new. History did not begin in 2023, and the Nakba is a century of violence. do not need to explain that the Nakba War, I do not need to explain the Nakba War nor the ongoing Nakba. I do not need to rehearse the simple historic reality that the Nakba War was one of invasion, dispossession, murder, and displacement of Palestinians from our homeland, from the river to the sea and all of the mountains in between. And as you all know and see, this continues. The Nakba remains ongoing, working to further fragment a land and her people. When we say from the river to the sea, it is about a homeland. It is about belonging. It is to what and where we return. We are of this land, and you all know this. And so when we say from the river to the sea, it is about life and living. We nor you should apologize or even give in to an explanation for that. It is absurd to try to explain that. As having a conversation about whether this is a genocide is equally absurd. Those anti-intellectual obfuscations waste our precious time. And so we know here that when we evoke the concept of Nakba, we understand the hope of return. We move from the ongoing Nakba into ongoing return. We do not ignore the violence that is meant to only eliminate us as a people, and in doing so, break our relationship with the land of Palestine. But we are more than that. As we saw at the beginning of this year, in January 2025, people in Gaza who endured multiple displacements under the burning skies, and as soon as the temperate ceasefire went into effect, people returned. We saw families and kin returning to the north of Gaza. We saw people returning throughout Gaza. This is who we are. Lessons constantly being taught to the world. While the right of return is certainly a part of what I try to describe as ongoing return, that is the right for all Palestinian refugees to return to the land of Palestine. Ongoing return is bigger and is the ongoing practice of a remarkable people that makes theory. Practice makes theory. It is about relationality to our homeland and to each other, a means of continuously exploring our relation to the places from which we came and to which we belong. Ongoing return is held in the stories of Palestinians who endure the brutal violence of settler colonialism on the land and fil shatat. It is how we teach ourselves in the world that resistance is about love and belonging. Ongoing Nakba works to eliminate us and prevent our imaginations from thinking. The bombs attacking every living being in Gaza, the military tanks and planes that occupy every part of Palestine have forced us into a constant state of survival. But we are more than the ongoing Nakba. Ongoing return is our return to the land and our ongoing return to ourselves. Mine, like every Palestinian, is a story about belonging, not to claim the land as my own or ours, but to find ourselves through her and with her. And so ongoing return holds the grief, holds the sadness and the utter depravity of this ongoing Nakba, but it does so with a long history of gathering to return, ensconced in a deep sense of love and belonging. Because love, as a way of being and living, is the core of our relations to the land and to each other. We grieve because we love. We long for Palestine because we belong to Palestine. And in the hope of responding to myself and opening up a conversation here today and thinking about what we do when we gather, we are not performing intellectualism, and we are most certainly not reducing ourselves to an experiment. We bear a deep responsibility to not examine a genocide for the sake of it, to not fetishize Palestinian survival as a means to raise our voices without purpose. We are not only challenging the monsters, we are defying them, and we are creating a new world. It is not a coincidence that Palestinian scholars, scholarship, and Palestinian studies, and every voice that stands with Palestine and Palestinians are being targeted in all corners of the globe. The cruel old world cannot hear us. Our words defy their power. The anti-intellectualism of silencing anything about and by Palestinians is just that, a violent act and one of the many tools of violence to render you helpless. We are not helpless. We gather to return.
Thank you, Rana. Move on to Wendy.
Yeah, thank you. And you can all hear me? Okay. Yeah, thank you for that, Rana. It's difficult now to be talking about anything but Palestine. So I'm glad we've had space for that and can give it all the space that we can in the hour that we have. together. But I will be switching, I guess, gears a bit to my research on Syria. So first, I want to just thank APSN for dedicating space to this important topic. For a network of political scientists, it reminds us that we cannot understand politics without attention to people's lived experiences. And we cannot understand lived experience without attention to politics. So thank you for putting that interaction, connection front and center. With that, I'd like to begin with two important caveats. First, I am not Syrian. I have not lived war. So I speak today with a great sense of humility as a researcher who's been working on these topics. And second, my research on Syria has been almost exclusively with people forced to flee Syria. So here I quote the Syrian activist and writer Tamara al-Rafai, who had a beautiful piece in La Jumhuriya just last January, where she wrote, and I quote, "The global narrative about Syria has largely been shaped by those of us Syrians, those of us who left, who are able to tell our stories without risking our lives. Now is the time to listen to those who stayed." So thinking about everyday life in war, I think it's a key priority for those who study Syria or want to understand Syria, to really now think about accessing the stories and experiences of those who did not leave, and just want to flag that that's something that in my own work I have not been able to do thus far. So with that backdrop, thank you for this chance to think together about Sami's opening question, which has two parts as I see it. So first, Sami, you asked, how have I been working with this theme of everyday life in war? And I can say that I've been working with one very particular method, conducting open-ended interviews. So I've interviewed more than 500 Syrian asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants around the world since 2012. And based on that work, have written 2 books and some other articles and things. And in that sense, I use interviews as a way to document everyday life in revolution, war, and forced migration, but also think about storytelling, personal testimonials, as how people not just convey what they lived, but how they themselves make sense of that experience. In the course of narrating their experiences, construct their own identities and reveal their own identities, with identity as the answer to the question, who am I? So I think storytelling both can give us a sense of everyday life in war, and also allow us to witness how people themselves bring coherence and meaning to what it means to have lived violence. So that's a bit of how I've gone about working with everyday life in war. Sami's second question was, what concepts have been most generative for you? And here I'll have a bit more to say. So the stories that I've collected over the years, I think, bring to light 2 sort of contradictory experiences of everyday life in war. On the one hand, the stories I've collected always describe how living war is constant terror, ru'b. People describe shelling, bombing, siege, starvation, how the visceral experience of war, the sounds of planes, the waiting for bombs to drop can be as horrific as the actual explosions. The everyday experience of families hiding in basements or stairwells or bathrooms or wherever they can, at the same time that they know that there's nowhere to hide, especially when bombs are dropping from overhead. So living war is an experience of terror, as my interlocutors expressed it to me. At the same time, people describe a kind of normalization of terror, that when you have no other choice, you get used to it. And here there are various, I think, kind of illustrations of this way that people become normalized in spite of it all to the terror of violence. People I talked to always talked about the constant awareness of the possibility of death. It became, the fact you could die at any time became like the air you breathed. People would say everyone is a mashru'a shaheed, just a martyr in the making. And this could create a kind of immunity to shock. I remember one person who put it to me as, at first 1 or 2 people were killed, then 20, then it became normal. If we lost 50 people, we would say, thank God, it's only 50. This everyday experience in war creates new types of everyday knowledge. In many of the interviews I did, this was epitomized by people talking about how even children could differentiate between the types of different rockets and missiles or planes by their sounds. This became knowledge everybody had, an everyday sort of know-how under war conditions. How war reshaped the very rhythm of life to follow the timing of violence and anticipated violence. In the Syrian context, I think this was especially true in the era when there were demonstrations weekly on Fridays that people expected were going to end with killings and end with injuries and then end with funerals and burials. And the rhythm of the week became tuned to that expectation. So the everyday experience of war reconfigured time, and then like time could reconfigure space, not just in the kilometers and kilometers of rubble that we've seen in pictures and videos, but the fact that people had to, as we are now hearing about in Gaza, of course, as well, bury bodies in gardens, in parks, in streets, wherever they could, such that everyday places became marked with death. So that is some of the everyday experiences of war and how it remaked really every aspect of how humans made their way in the world. And these were many themes that emerged, especially in the interviews I did during the early years of the Syrian uprising and war, when many of my interlocutors expressed an urgent need to document all that was happening. But as the years passed and the frequency and the ferocity of the military battle slowed, a different need became palpable among people I talked to, and that was really the need to make sense of it all. So to quote one of my interviewees, he said, "When you're inside the conflict or you're escaping, you think only of survival. It's fight or flight. Your brain says, throw this to the back of your mind. And then when you've settled somewhere, it comes back to you slowly." So many people I spoke to, once they had obtained perhaps some minimal level of stability, their story suggested that they were reaching that kind of a phase where the things that they maybe weren't able to think about, or the ways they weren't able to think when they were amidst the struggle for survival, took on new space. So I think that says that there are aspects of what it means to live war that might not be immediately apparent at the time, either to observers or to survivors themselves, but are revealed with time and reflection. And with reflection, then, a new concept emerged organically in my interviews and also became very salient in the writings and other forms of self-expression among displaced Syrians. And that's home. And that's why I made home the kind of framing lens for my book. And it might be interesting to think about how home connects to the belonging that Rana was speaking about. So when I say home in English, I have in mind terms in Arabic like watan, also like beit, dar, and menzil, and also intima. I think all of those aspects kind of come together in the English word home. When I began asking displaced Syrians, what does home mean to you? I found that this was a way of asking, after so much violence and loss, who have you become? What is it that you need to find peace in this shattered world? What is it that you need to own the world again and keep pushing forward? So in that sense, home captured some of what we might call the everyday afterlife of war. It's of course misleading to talk about after when people carry the experience of violence and oppression inside them. But I thought the concept of home in some ways provided a window into this latter phase of war. So I collected Syrian stories of losing home, searching for home, finding home, not finding home, thinking about what home even means. And found that this was a way of talking about how people reconcile with the experience of war and violence, how it shapes their trajectories and their sense of self long after the bombs stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. We'll move on to Asma.
Thank you so much, Sami. And thanks, Rana, for framing the conversation as you did in the beginning, and for centering, you and Wendy, for centering civilians, not just as studied or as a phenomenon or as a narrative, but actual human beings and lived lives that experience these atrocities every day. I began my research in a similar line, I think, in exploring that from experience of living for some years in civil war in Libya, which is still continuous, and then later on wanting to just seeing basically on the news the figureheads of the war, the people who are causing the war, their aspirations, their plans for the country, their perspectives on the conflict, lots of analysts who would speak on different actors, and there was no knowledge, or there's no conversation to be had with the people who experience it. A lot of people who are causing the war or making decisions for cause of the war are often have their children are abroad or themselves are abroad, and have sort of a safety net where they could imagine a future, whilst I wanted to understand how young people, especially those who grew up in the middle of the civil war, so from they were young children in 2011 and in the years after, and women, and how that experience was for them. And I've learned that, and I adopted an explorative approach where I learned that war not just shapes the presence and the future, but also changes perspectives on the past, in terms of politics, in terms of society, in terms of culture. So young people growing up in war have an extremely different view from other generations. For instance, though it's Gaddafi's time, for instance, there's a sense of nostalgia. And also, I found that this connection to the past, before war, builds a sort of a story of safety, of a better times, and that somehow not shapes, but it contributes into what the future holds. So a lot of young people, for instance, see a strong military man as an authoritarian figure, as an actual savior, as someone who would lead in politics, as someone who would protect them from all those fragmentations and the different armed groups. Whereas a lot of young people who would, and that's, I think, just special about young people who are still able to imagine a future because they work towards, jobs or go to school or universities. But at the same time, they talk about this sense, the chronic sense of instability, if they actually don't know if they survive even, going to university or going to schools. A lot of them lose their schools, lose the universities, lose access to a lot of these futures, especially outside of urban cities or places that are somewhat safe. Young people are saying that, well, I don't know if I have a future, but I have somehow to have a plan. And it is an exercise, I think, in constant trying to live, as Wendy described, in the midst of a lot of death. So death is always in the back of the mind for a lot of organizational day-to-day routine. People, especially in the cities that there's heavy shellings or that the armed groups are fighting. In Libya, the fighting is different in different geographical areas. People have wake up in the morning, call friends to say, how is that road? Is it open? They would call their work. Is it safe to come to work today? And they plan these social events around different times and curfews. At the moment in Tripoli, things are very tense and have been very tense for the past 2 weeks. And so people have their own curfews. They don't need anyone telling them not to go out at different times of the day, and especially in areas controlled by these groups where kidnappings happen, hijacking of cars, theft, and everyday violence. So people organize themselves according to this, and that shapes a lot the social interactions. It transforms the physical and emotional landscape. In a lot of my research, I don't address psychological aspect, but so much of it comes out, especially for young people and men, who address the psychological trauma of war and the difficulties of it, not just of symptoms, but of having these crippling anxieties and PTSD symptoms whilst trying to come up with coping mechanisms. for their existence. And I noted amongst women, there's a very different vulnerability in war, an extra vulnerability in war, especially in fear of sexual violence, in fear of kidnapping. In Libya, armed groups practice kidnapping of civilians, especially if they are related to someone. They want to exert some sort of pressure. They could be a civil servant, they could be someone important, they could be, it doesn't matter, there's diverse reasons for it. And so the women of these in these families, or in relation to the men who are in contact with these armed groups, have a specific vulnerability that they experience every day. And then when I speak to mothers of victims, there's also an aspect, and I think we haven't written quite a lot about, of motherhood in war, and the loss of basically a woman's labor, her entire labor, her emotional connection to the country as well, because there becomes a conflict between the people and the country when the perpetrators, especially in a civil war, are your neighbors, are people you know, people you connect with normally. And I found that in contrast of a lot of these complex themes is people resort a lot to cultural practices that are artistic, to storytelling, to give meanings to a lot of the wars and the trauma that they experience. As I mentioned, the connection to the past. But more and more, and as long as the years go on for the war, and now at the moment we are reaching 14 something years of protracted conflict, basically, there is more and more loss in thinking about what Libya will be in the future. So there is a thinking of individually of what I will be and what I will do and what will I have to do. And there is a loss of thinking of what this country will be. Now we have a generation that is growing up in a divided Libya. It's been divided since 2014 with two governments living different realities and experiences. And there isn't so much connection. I mean, civil society efforts try to bring this connection between the two, at least the three regions, but there isn't so much connection. So I think our young people in Libya are growing up not knowing what this Libya will be. And I don't think there is much hope. I think that's the experience of everyday life in war, is that what they describe, I don't like the term resilience anymore, but they describe as resilience as this fighting and doing everyday things and working and coming up with these initiatives. At the same time, it's you don't really think about the future in that very much long-term sense. Or if you think about it, you think about it elsewhere. So a lot of young people are thinking about the future, but not exactly where they live. And that is vague because they don't know if they can emigrate, they don't know where to go, and they don't know the prospects of being anywhere else. Also, there is this increasing sense that it's not better anywhere else in the world, you know? I mean, especially with Libya's connection to migration and the stories that come from there, Libyans understand that things are more hostile in Europe, things are more hostile in the US. And so this thinking of safe places is also changing. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. So I have some questions, comments, thoughts that I will sort of put out to you, and then in the meantime, if people want to ask questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and then I'll field those questions. But thank you so much for these comments. I've been a bit I feel a bit shell-shocked from sort of listening to this and the experiences. And so I have two things I want to kind of throw out to you. One is, if you can, talk about how it is you do what you do, with all that's happening, whether it's in Palestine, Libya, Syria, whether you know you're working on, Wendy, for example, Syria, but stuff in Palestine is going on. But also there's a sense I feel that oftentimes, and Rana brought this up about sort of how, you know, doing this intellectualizing and how do you do the intellectual work. And you said you don't know, right? Like you answered your own question by saying, I don't know, like sort of, you know, we're invited into the space and what are we doing? So maybe this part that I'm kind of asking us to sort of elaborate on the I don't know and try to give some sense and material to it. That, you know, what is, I guess in a sense, like what is the role of the intellectual in these times, right? And also the everyday life, you know, we're talking about the civilians or victims or however you want to call them in war, right? But what is the sort of everyday life of the intellectual working in this kind of zone, right? Whether it's a settler colonial zone or war zone, how do you live that life and how do you sort of push forward when oftentimes it feels maybe meaningless, right? You know, Wendy, when you were doing these interviews back in the day when Assad was bombing, right? Like some these things are, yeah. So maybe I don't know if that that question, if you can say a few words on that. And then if there aren't other questions, I'll ask my second question. Rana, you want to start us off? I know you said you don't know, but maybe sort of elaborate a little
I
bit.
mean, I suppose Sammy was a disingenuous, I don't know. I mean, I should reveal that right now, right? It's not so much that I do know what we should do, but I wanted to sort of put that out there and frame that this isn't just an exercise in speaking aloud, right? That we bear responsibility, and a deep one. And I think again, I began by saying that Palestine's not an exception, but it is world making, because right now, in this moment, what's happening in Palestine I argue, and I don't think it's that audacious of an argument, forecast what happens next in the world. And we're seeing this. We're seeing this great divide and rupture between people responding and opposing this genocide, and governments not, right? So that kind of, you know, we saw this last year in the student intifada. We saw this in the counter-revolution with these administrations representing the fascist forces of the states and putting down the student intifada from the US throughout Europe. And so the question then becomes, how do we do what we do, which is what you were asking. And I don't think it's something that is necessarily confined to the role of the intellectual. I think it's the role of the human. And in some ways, the intellectual kind of narrates, in our best capacity, can try to narrate people's stories. So one of the things that I didn't talk about when I began, because I was so adamant about trying to frame this, was I'm a historian, but my methodology is to think through and with people's stories, and to hold those with the kind of responsibility that I think the past and the present and the future require from us. And in Palestine and amongst Palestinians worldwide, this is not just a question of being in Palestine. There was this maybe a decade ago, in the time of Edward Said, 2 decades ago, this notion is that if people knew, then they would oppose. If people knew, then they would speak up. If people knew. And right now, and I think this is something that Palestinians have been trying to tell people, is that if people knew can't be it can't be the ceiling, it's the ground. And because for 20 months now, people do know, they just choose not to, or they choose to obfuscate, or, you know, the governments have so fundamentally dehumanized Palestinian life that it's no longer on a metric of living, right? This has always been the case. This is how settler colonialism functions. We're just seeing it without a need to sort of deconstruct it, because the powers that be are saying what they believe to be true. So what do we do? What do we do is that we are intellectuals because we want to live in the world that we want to live in and not succumb to the world that we do live in. It's about imagining that. It is as audacious as thinking that emancipation and liberation is something that we need to be a part of. And in order to do that, that means that it's not just about if people knew. It means that we have to understand that when people do know, how do we act and mobilize and gather? And in the gathering, what does that mean about making and forcing change? So I teach under occupation, and part of the it is like Birzeit University is like every other university in the world. It is an institution that thinks through financial crisis, that thinks through all of the stuff that we have to deal with in all of the institutions that we're at. But we're also we are tasked to be relevant. This is not something that we can put aside. To be relevant means that what we teach in the classroom, what we share in the classroom, how we gather and share knowledge, there is a requirement of being relevant, which is almost sometimes unbearable, but it is constantly necessary. And so that means the intellectualism that you were describing, Sammy, isn't just a practice in sort of how well we can speak or not. It's about taking texts and events and theories and concepts and practice and methodology and making them relevant, not only in the context of Palestine, but in the context of this notion of world making, which political scientists put in a place, but anthropologists and historians put in a different place, about sort of, again, imagining the world that we want to live in and not the one, and not succumbing to the one that we do live in. So it's really difficult to explain to you how we do what we do, other than to tell you, Sammy, that it is an essential and existential practice in doing what we do.
Thank you, Rana. Others, Wendy, you wanna?
Yeah, no, I thank you for asking the question, and Rana for putting it on the table in this way. It's, I mean, during this genocide in Gaza, I think it's been mind-boggling to know what to do. And as Rana said in her opening remarks, it's not the time to create knowledge about genocide for the sake of creating knowledge about genocide. Our first and foremost obligation is for whether as scholars or as humans, just use every bit of capacity we have to try to end this. Anything else is not important. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, in terms of Palestine now, I really appreciate these ideas that the whole, if people only knew paradigm, it does not make any sense. No one can say that they don't know what's happening. As Rana said, either people choose not to, or many, millions have gone out into the streets for months after months after months saying no, and it does not seem to be having the effect on governments and state policy. So I don't know what that means is even the usefulness of knowledge. There's, I think, so much we have to rethink about what we may have taken as some sort of assumptions that there were some sort of limits on violence and the old assumptions. Although this is clearly, as Rana also said, this is nothing new. There's a whole other level that I think we had to grapple with for a long time to come. But in the work that I did on Syria, there was still this sort of, if people only knew, kind of a paradigm or motivation. And at the time that I was writing or doing interviews, I think that there was trying to push against either a stream of conversations about the Syrian uprising and war that said, oh, it's really complicated, there are all of these different groups, or this is a matter of geopolitics with these different states, or this sort of anti-imperialist left apologizing for Assad's tyranny. So there was sort of space to create a narrative to amplify the voices of Syrians calling for freedom and for dignity, to push against alternative narratives that denied that, or even to influence voices of those who might have been sympathetic to Syrian struggle, but didn't think it was important enough act on and show any real solidarity. So in that sense, my approach to trying to capture everyday stories of war and also of injustice and oppression and authoritarianism was the hope that it could contribute to creating knowledge, and knowledge could creating empathy. But it made sense, I think, in that time and place.
Thanks. Asma?
Yeah, I think I have different reasons or different reasons, yes, why I feel like I do what I do, but also varying different difficulties of doing them. So for Libya, there's the first reason, the most obvious and simple for me, is that not only that there is very little knowledge of Libya even before the war, but that it has been sort of intentionally removed from the media because it's a failure of an intervention of a NATO, of Western governments, intervention of 2011. So it is hard to get anything out there. And for me, it was feeling a bit responsible, of course, as someone with the privilege of having access and speaking another language and being able to write and intellectualize, is to document. So it's always, for me, the initial reason is to document how Libyans lived through these different times, how different people lived these different times. The second reason was always to inform my activism or the projects that I was involved in. And it was also the reason why my supervisor and other more senior academics always told me or advised me against working so much on Libya, because of the enmeshment, because I'm not just thinking from afar, I'm also participating and doing things. And these people sometimes I speak with, I connect with, and I do things with. So and the third reason is because I am often having a platform where I could, for instance, advise people in senior positions or on policy. And there are different difficult things. Working and doing research at the same time is hard. There isn't moments of silence to think, because you feel quite a lot, right? You feel so much when a war breaks out again, or infighting happening again, or the neighborhoods that you have worked with or working on are facing difficulties, and you are far away. And of course, you always carry, as someone especially who leaves the country, you carry always also this guilt of surviving whilst others haven't survived what has happened. And since the genocide in Gaza, I found it extremely difficult. I used to be attending all these sorts of policy meetings and to bring my research, but also my work into more practice. But I haven't been able to do so because I found it difficult to sit in any room with anyone who has the power to do anything without acknowledging what's happening and without apologizing for not being able to do anything about it, or for not wanting to do anything about it. And so now I'm in this space where even at the UN level, and not just like with, for instance, EU governments, etc., even at the UN level, I find it very hard to sit in a room with people in power without acknowledgements, without sorting, and not like carrying on as if nothing is going on, and I have to talk about Libya, or I have to talk about this or that topic. So it is a difficult, I think it is this very, very difficult position to continue to do what to do, and you constantly rethink. I mean, I believe in universal human rights, right? This is one of the core values that I believe in, but I have been thinking for the past now 2 years is, how do I still communicate that with the people that I work with on the issues that I work on in Libya, when I can't explain why they're not working, why no one is backing any of these systems that are now failing the people in Gaza and the people of Palestine. So it's and that there is this moral collapse, right? That is not just of international humanitarian law, it's the collapse also of UN system, of universality of rights, of how to approach this. And so yeah, it's not easy. So I still feel like I can stick to documentation. I'm not going to do meetings anymore, and not without the proper framework of acknowledgement and action. I don't feel like I have the stomach to sit in that. And that's the hard part, I think, sometimes about research, is sometimes having the stomach to also sit and think about these things, you know, and then write them down in a way that makes sense to other people.
Asma, thank you for that. Rana, you wanted to jump in or something?
Just really quickly, if I can, I just want to sort of dovetail on what Esma was saying, is that I actually disagree with you. I don't think the system has collapsed as much as it's been attacked. And that attack is a necessary thing for us to stand, take a deep breath, and think about. In the same way that universities are being attacked, right? What about universities, intellectual production, international human rights, be it the principle of justice or the actual letter of law of justice? What is it about that that is being attacked by these, by the end of modernity, basically, if I want to put it in an apocalyptic way? And so once we think about that in that way, we can actually be empowered. Is that your belief, Esma, in this universal justice is a righteous belief? Why? Because the monsters have attacked it, right? The atrocities are directly attacking students on campus. Why? Because they have power. And so if we think about it as an attack, if we think about administrations, be it political or institutional administrations, as being attacked, that means that is, in the terms of, I think, what political scientists say, is counter-revolution, which means that we can further understand and reinforce our own revolutionary selves. And if that becomes how we think about things, then we are empowered, right? And so, yeah, the sky does feel like it's falling, but it's not our sky that's necessarily falling. And being attacked means it's hard because one has to endure and survive, and many will not. But the idea is that we represent a kind of defiance of what you were just describing, Esma, which is this notion of universal justice and what our elders have taught us as humanism, right? And that's what we hold on to, I think. And that is the revolutionary sort of righteousness of what it means to be among the oppressed and writing about the oppressed and working towards ending oppression.
Rana, I really like the way you reframed collapse into attack. I think we oftentimes think of these things of collapse, but I also want to take pause and think about the fact that it's, you know, the Palestinian in Palestine who's facing erasure is teaching us to stand up and attack and you know, persevere. So thank you for this moment that I think Palestinians keep somehow teaching us despite you know, these kind of threats of elimination. And you know, we're running out of time, and I guess I did want to just throw out maybe concluding remarks that I had initially wanted to sort of throw out to you all as a question. But you know, we're sitting here today talking about Palestine, Libya, Syria, and I always find it difficult. On one hand, you know, how do we hold the Arab world together and hold space for these places at the same time without flattening these, you know, what's going on? And I find it very difficult because on one hand, we must hold space together, right? It's super important. But on the other hand, it's also very difficult to hold that kind of that space because you know, the the word war, as I said in the beginning, it like flattens, right? And there are different processes going on in these across this, you know, this one landscape, if you will, or the, you know, this region, but there are different processes going on, different forms of conflict. And so it's, you know, on one hand, it's really difficult. But I also heard from you all today as you were talking intersections of experiences. I know, like, when Wendy was speaking, I could hear Gaza. She was talking about Syria. And when Asma was talking, I could see Wendy nodding. But at the same time, they're not, they are different. And so I think we need to just, I'm constantly sort of, I find that difficult to kind of to think through and keep checking. But I guess maybe I'll give you each a minute to conclude, so I'm not having the last word. Sahar did say, how could we think of the future scenarios of these conflicts? Rana had said earlier, we're intellectuals because we want to think about the world we want to live in, and it's about world making. So I think that dovetails with thinking about the future. So yeah, if you have any last concluding remarks, maybe I can start with you, Asma, this time.
Okay. And thanks, Rana, for that. I do need some push to not go into depressive episodes thinking about all these things. Yeah, so I think what Pan-Arabist regime have been successfully able to do is really separate us into islands, not just by visas, but also by completely disconnected. And despite this, people still feel each other across borders, of course. And I think there is space to be speaking about all of our causes, to stand up in solidarity, but also to know when to do that. So there has to be lots of strategies for that. But most importantly is that we do need to think how our wars also impact each other. Syria and Libya are not disconnected at all. Not because of Turkey or UAE. Gaza was mentioned quite a lot of time in Libyan news because of these atrocious plans of moving people from Gaza to Libya, for instance, or relocating them to Libya. Libya as being host to all of these international plans of migration, which it has been. So and Libya has a connection to Egypt, and then in Egypt to Gaza. So we're not far. Libya is involved in the war in Sudan, where there are threats also of genocide. So we're not really distant, and our contexts are often also impacted by each other. And the governments entrench themselves by separating the population, but connecting with each other on surveillance and oppression and suppression in the region. So more awareness of this, and more we're bringing up where we could connect, and of course where appropriate there has to be a focus on one certain, and our voice has to be one, and when appropriate it could be different contexts and different countries. As to the future, I mean, I don't see the war in Libya ending anytime soon, or the situation as it is ending anytime soon. So as I always say, it's the work has to be continuous. We need to have a lot of patience and a long breath, and have a very strong community around us, whether they are academics or activists, and yeah, just thinking that it's a long fight.
Thank you. Wendy?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to begin then with your question, Sammy, in terms of holding the Arab world together, but not flattening these differences. I mean, I'll agree with Asma that, I mean, one of the things APSN's approach in this of having different people speak about a specific country, and then we can look and see what's common, what's shared, what's different, is helpful, and to not only see differences and similarities, but also that each country's experience might be almost like causally a part of another country's experience. So for example, Syrians often talk about how the world community's allowing of Assad's atrocities, of shedding of every international norm in the use of violence against civilians, could help to contribute to the world of that we now see genocide unfolding in. So learning about different countries and how they each have contributed, and their experiences contribute to the world we live in including the absence of any sort of international law having any effect. I think it's helpful in that sense. As far as the future here, I think Syria offers a glimmer of hope, and perhaps one of the most important in the region today. That clearly the challenges that Syrians are facing are enormous. Some of the disappointments of the last 6 months, and especially the horrific sectarian violence in March and ongoing before and after then, is incredibly disturbing. But the fact that the Assad regime has fallen is the needed step for Syrians to have some future in which they can reclaim the country for themselves. And as Asma said, the struggle can be long, and there can be perhaps lights at the end of it that gives hope for other situations as well.
Thanks, Rana.
I think this is where it's useful and helpful to think as a historian and sort of think culturally as well. I think the struggle or the tension, Sami, that you were talking about in holding together the Arab world is just two parts. It's understanding what colonialism is in terms of dividing and ruling. It's understanding that imperialism and colonialism created the borders that we now have to endure. And it's also understanding that there's a longer history, and there's a longer sort of resistance to that history that's not only about the present. So I think it's really important to not be prisoners of the present, because that's also obviously a tool, I think, of imperialism, and a tool of sort of having us fall into that feeling of overwhelmedness that Esma was talking about. We have a lot of lessons that Palestinians and Egyptians and Sudanese learn from Libya. I mean, we don't understand fascism in the Arab world without understanding the history of Libya. It's a huge component of that. Settler colonialism, before there was Zionism, we understood what settler colonialism meant when we were thinking about what is parts of North Africa, including Libya. So I think not succumbing to sort of, one, the present, and two, the boundaries imposed on us either intellectually or politically through colonialism. And I also want to think about the longer history of the question that you asked, Sami, is that this isn't the first time that Arabs have struggled to think about Arab unity, right? So let's not forget the decolonial era of the mid 20th century. We have a great deal of critique about Abdel Nasser in Europe, in Egypt, and a great deal of critique about Hezbollah, both in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. But there was also an earnest attempt to think through that. And so the commonalities that Wendy was talking about is this common language in our culture, right? So we actually read each other. Poets and writers are an easy place to turn to not fall into that despair of thinking about the kind of divisions that exist amongst us. And Huda Fakhreddin, who's a professor of literature at the University of Pennsylvania, has been writing for the last year about thinking about Arab culture through literature, and actually thinking about politics and opposing oppression and the genocide. And so I think one of the writers who's probably one of the most translated, I mean, we have Tahir Wattar, and we read him daily in Palestine. That doesn't mean he stops being Algerian. It just means it is these kind of commonalities that we think about. And one of perhaps the most prolific and widely read artists amongst us, poets and authors, is Ghassan Kanafani. So if you allow me, Sami, I'm just going to quote from what has now been quoted for the last actually, it's had a new life. It was first written in 1956, and it has many, as Wendy was saying, afterlives because of these endless and ongoing wars on Palestine and in Gaza. And just allow me to quote a paragraph from Ghassan Kanafani's letter from Gaza, which was originally written in 1956. May I have this moment, Sami? Yes, okay. This is Kanafani. My friend, never shall I forget Nadia's leg, amputated from the top of the thigh. No, nor shall I forget the grief which had molded her face and merged into its traits forever. I went out of the hospital in Gaza that day, my hand clutched in silent derision on the 2 pounds I had brought with me to give to Nadia. The blazing sun filled the streets with the color of blood, and Gaza was brand new, Mustafa. You and I never saw it like this. The stone piled up at the beginning of the Shaja'iyya quarter where we lived had a meaning, and they seem to have been put there for no other reason but to explain it. This Gaza, which we had lived, and with whose good people we have spent 7 years of defeat, was something new. It seemed to me just a beginning. I don't know why I thought it was just a beginning. I imagined that the main street that I walked along on the way back home was only the beginning of a long, long road leading to Safad. Everything in Gaza throbbed with sadness, which was not confined to weeping. It was a challenge. More than that, it was something like a reclamation of the amputated leg. Free Palestine.
Thank you all. On that note, I think we'll end on Free Palestine. You don't have to hear from me much more. Thank you all for speaking today, for sharing with us your knowledge, for all those who have attended and stayed with us. And thank you to the Arab Political Science Network for also hosting us. And we'll see you at the next session, I guess, as Ahmed said.
يعطيكم العافية.